Hello, everyone. This is recording number 2 for Plato, a class on the Republic. Today, I want to talk about the structure of the Republic. And given the complexity of the dialogue, there are, of course, any number of ways of thinking about the structure. But I want to pick just one, namely based on where we are in our reading of the dialogue. We are still at the beginning of the semester and we are reading the early books. And right at the beginning of book 1, something comes up that can be really useful for thinking about the structure of the dialogue. Namely, the interlocutors formulate 2 questions. Now, if you read a treatise or a paper or whatever in philosophy, you might think it's going to have a topic. It's going to be about one question. So the fact that the Republic is about 2 questions is somehow noteworthy and just something to reflect upon. These 2 questions are, what is justice, and is justice advantageous? Where this means, is justice to the advantage of the person who is just? Now, when scholars discuss these 2 questions, they sometimes use the following terminology. They describe the first question, what is justice, as a what question or a what is X question. And sometimes they even say it is a definitional question, a question that seeks a definition. And they describe the question of whether justice is advantageous as a how question, a question that asks whether justice has a given property or quality, namely that it is advantageous for the person who is just. Now, once we discuss that distinction between what questions and how questions, we may be reminded of the Meno, because the Meno, which is another Platonic dialogue, offers some explicit reflection on the relationship between what questions and how questions. And whatever we think about the relative chronology of Plato's dialogues, and all of that is contested, we may still just maybe go with the conventional assumption for now that the Meno is perhaps a little bit earlier than the Republic, but somewhat in the vicinity. So it isn't far-fetched to think about the Meno as we try to understand the Republic. Now, in the Meno, Socrates quite strongly commits to what we may call a kind of methodological principle of the priority of what questions. He says that one cannot address successfully one of these how questions if one doesn't know what something is. And in the Meno, this is about the 2 questions, what is virtue and is virtue teachable? So he says we cannot ask whether virtue is teachable if we don't know what virtue is. Or at least we cannot ask that in a way that is going to be the beginning of a successful line of inquiry. Now, if we think that that is, as it were, the takeaway from the Meno, a commitment to the view that first we need to talk about these what is X questions, and then we can talk about the how question, then we may think that gives us a kind of key to the structure of the Republic. We may think, well, at the very beginning of the Republic, the 2 questions are somehow introduced and discussed in a preliminary fashion, but then we turn to the what question. And book 4 offers an account of what justice is. And then the later books address in a number of ways whether justice is advantageous. For example, when we ask whether someone who is perfectly unjust, the tyrant, whether that person is miserable or happy. So that is another way of asking whether that person is, benefiting from being unjust or in fact suffering from it. Now, that gives us a quite straightforward reading of the Republic. Introduction of 2 questions. First, the what question, then in-depth exploration of the how question. But I want to spend the rest of this recording with reasons to hesitate and just some considerations on why we might not accept this picture. Here is the first reason to hesitate. when we refer to the Meno, and that is an interesting and legitimate thing to do, in my view, we cannot just refer to its beginning. At the beginning of the Meno, Socrates indeed commits to the idea that we cannot address a how question successfully if we don't have an answer to the what question. However, he is not able to hold on to this as the conversation progresses in the Meno. He would like to talk about what is virtue, but he and his interlocutor Meno are not successful in coming up with an answer to that question. They do not find an account of virtue. And nevertheless, Meno would really like to talk about whether virtue is teachable. And at some point, Socrates says, okay, I still prefer my question about what virtue is, but I see that you would just love to talk about whether virtue is teachable. And here is a proposal. Let us introduce a new method. And that new method is called the hypothetical method. And I'm not going to talk now about any specifics about it. But the point is that at this point in the Meno, Plato introduces a new method which enables the interlocutors to talk about how virtue is, even though they do not have an account of what virtue is. So the takeaway from the Meno for the Republic should be that the kind of way in which what questions and how questions relate is maybe a place for methodological innovation. So what we should be looking for is maybe not a simple progression from talk about what questions to talk about how questions, but rather we might look for methodological innovation which somehow responds to the fact that what and how questions can seem to be deeply intertwined. Now, here is the second reason for just pausing and thinking more about this. Often scholars say that Book 4 of the Republic provides Plato's official account of justice. But when you look at Book 4, it is not so clear that that is what you find. You don't find, as it were, one definition of justice, flagged as this is our definition, this is our answer to the what is justice question. Rather, Socrates says a number of things about what justice is. And this kind of series of things that he says about what justice is does not seem necessarily complete. So it is unclear whether we have a complete account of justice. On the contrary, it seems that we could just as well continue to think further about what justice is and maybe add something. So the assumption that the what question, the what is justice question, is as it were taken care of in Book 4 does not seem justified. Now, here is the third reason to hesitate. And to some extent, that may be the deepest reason, and I already somewhat mentioned it. Inquiry into what something is and how it is may in fact be deeply intertwined. And that seems to come out of any number of conversations in the Republic. And here I mentioned just one example, going back to what I already mentioned about the tyrant. When we ask whether the tyrant, this kind of perfectly unjust person, is happy or miserable, that is ostensibly about whether injustice is to the tyrant's advantage or disadvantage. So it is about the how question. But as we talk about this, we learn something about what injustice is. Namely, it is a kind of radical disintegration of the soul away from justice. Now, as we learn what injustice is, or perfect injustice is, why shouldn't we assume that thereby we also continue to learn something about what justice is? So that would be one of the ways in which the Book 4 account of justice is by no means complete. Okay, so I end here. And all I wanted to propose is that there are reasons to reflect quite deeply on the relationship of what and how questions in Plato's Republic, and to kind of take the beginning of book one, where those two questions are raised, as a reason to read the Republic with a view to whether Plato has methodologically interesting things to say as he goes along about the relationship between these two kinds of questions.